Once cheered by thousands, Darren Wade is found kneeling in a rain-soaked Dallas parking lot, gathering coins from the mud until billionaire Marcus Cole opens his car door and begins a painful journey to remind a broken man that even after losing his fame, his home, and his belief in himself, he is still someone worth finding, loving, and bringing back. The rain had been falling over Dallas for hours, and the temperature kept dropping. Outside a small gas station, a man stood beneath a narrow awning, holding a piece of cardboard that was slowly falling apart in his hands. His name was Darren Wade. Years earlier, thousands of basketball fans had shouted that name inside packed arenas. Tonight, almost no one recognized him. Written across his sign were 7 simple words: "I don't need much, just one meal." Darren's coat was too thin for the cold, and the sole of his right shoe had nearly come loose. He had tied it together with a piece of wire, but water still soaked through. He had not eaten since the previous morning. Every few minutes he shifted his weight, trying to keep feeling in his feet. Cars passed beneath the bright city lights, but most drivers avoided looking at him. Some locked their doors as they approached. A man in a large SUV lowered his window and threw several coins toward Darren. They landed in a muddy puddle near the curb. Darren stared at them for a moment, then slowly knelt to pick them up. Hunger had taken away most of the pride he once had. As he searched through the dirty water, he noticed 2 people holding up their phones and recording him. Once, strangers had filmed Darren because they admired him. Now they filmed him because they could not believe how far he had fallen. Darren no longer felt angry. He had been angry when his career ended, when friends stopped calling, and when people began treating him like a problem instead of a person. That anger had faded into something worse. He had started believing he deserved the cold, the hunger, and the way strangers looked through him. Somewhere along the way, he stopped seeing himself as a good man in a terrible situation. He began to see himself as a terrible man who had finally received the life he deserved. Inside the gas station, 12-year-old Noah Bennett watched from behind the window. Noah helped the owner after school and sold newspapers to earn a little money for his family. He had seen Darren outside several times, but the man had never bothered anyone. He always moved aside when families walked past and never entered the store without permission. Noah had also noticed something the people recording Darren had missed. Earlier that evening, Darren had helped an elderly homeless man pull a plastic sheet over his shoulders before the rain became heavier. Noah took a warm sandwich from the store and filled a paper cup with water. He walked outside and held them toward Darren. Darren stepped back and said he had no money. Noah placed the food beside him without asking questions. Before returning inside, he said, "I don't know what mistakes you made, but a hungry person should still be fed before anyone judges him." The words were simple, but Darren looked at the boy as though no one had spoken to him with kindness in years. Darren picked up the sandwich and held it close to his face. The smell of warm bread made his stomach hurt. He broke it into 2 pieces, ate one half slowly, and wrapped the other half before placing it in his pocket. Saving food had become a habit because he never knew when the next meal would come. A few minutes later, he noticed an older homeless man sitting behind the ice machine and coughing beneath a plastic sheet. Darren took the uneaten half from his pocket and left it beside him. He told the man the store was giving away food because he did not want him to feel guilty for accepting it. Noah watched everything through the window. Darren had been hungry enough to kneel in muddy water for a few coins, yet he still gave away half his meal. Noah quietly placed another sandwich near the register. The store owner saw him but did not object. He simply removed the sandwich from the sales list and continued working. Neither of them said anything, but both understood that Darren had not lost everything inside himself. As the parking lot emptied, Darren sat against the brick wall and reached into the inside pocket of his coat. He checked the 3 possessions he still protected carefully. The first was a faded wristband from his final professional game. The second was an old photograph of Darren as a child sitting on his mother's shoulders. The third was a worn piece of paper with his mother's telephone number written on it. In the photograph, his mother, Evelyn, was young and smiling. Darren remembered only small pieces of that day: the smell of popcorn, a balloon tied to his wrist, and his mother carrying him home when he became tired. On the back of the picture, Evelyn had written, "You do not have to win before you are allowed to come home." She had written it after Darren lost an important game and called her in tears. At the time, he thought she was only talking about basketball. Years later, Darren understood what she had meant. Home was not supposed to be a reward for people who succeeded. It was supposed to be the place where someone could return after losing. But Darren had stayed away too long. He had broken promises, ignored calls, and disappeared whenever his mother came close to finding him. He feared that if she opened the door now, she would not see her son. She would see the man kneeling in the mud while strangers recorded him. Near midnight, Noah brought out the second sandwich and left it beside Darren. This time, Darren did not refuse. He held the photograph of his mother and imagined walking inside to use the telephone. For a moment, he pictured himself telling her that he was cold, hungry, and afraid. He imagined hearing her say that the porch light was still on. But the courage passed, and Darren lowered his head again. Before leaving, Noah asked the gas station owner if Darren could remain beneath the awning until morning. The owner looked outside and quietly nodded. Darren never heard the conversation. He closed his eyes with his mother's photograph against his chest and listened to the rain striking the metal roof. Once, he had lived for the sound of thousands of people applauding him. Tonight, he needed only one safe place where he did not have to perform. The city passed Darren without seeing him, but one boy did. And sometimes, before a person can be saved, the first thing they need is simply to be seen. The next morning, the rain had slowed, but Darren was still sitting beneath the gas station awning. His wet jacket had dried in uneven patches, revealing the faded name Wade across the back. A customer walking toward the store stopped when he saw it. He looked at Darren's face, then searched for an old basketball photo on his phone. Within seconds, he realized the tired man by the curb was Darren Wade, the former professional player whose jersey had once filled stores across the city. But instead of speaking to him, the customer stepped behind a gas pump and began recording. The video lasted only 17 seconds. It showed Darren kneeling beside a puddle, searching through dirty water for coins someone had thrown from a car. His hands were shaking, his clothes were soaked, and his damaged shoe was held together with wire. The recording did not show Noah bringing him a warm sandwich. It did not show Darren saving half of it for later, then giving that half to an elderly homeless man. It captured the most humiliating moment and left out everything that proved Darren was still kind. By noon, the video had spread across social media. People shared it with shocked captions and laughing emojis, asking how a man who had once earned millions could end up begging outside a gas station. Old photographs of Darren in his uniform appeared beside screenshots of him kneeling in the mud. Television programs replayed his worst public mistakes, including arrests, angry outbursts, and failed treatment attempts. Strangers who had never met him spoke as though they understood his entire life. Very few asked what had happened during the quiet years when there were no cameras. Some people expressed concern, but even their sympathy often sounded like judgment. They said Darren had wasted every opportunity and disappointed everyone who once believed in him. Others treated his suffering like entertainment, waiting to see what would happen next. No one mentioned the injuries he had played through, the nights he could not sleep, or the illness he had tried to hide because professional athletes were expected to appear fearless. The world had reduced decades of pain to 17 seconds. It was easier to blame Darren than to admit that a person could once have everything and still become lost. That afternoon, Darren entered the gas station to escape the cold. A small television above the counter was showing a sports news program, and his face filled the screen. The host spoke about his fall from fame, while the same clip played again and again. A customer near the coffee machine laughed and said Darren had once been his favorite player until he threw his life away. Darren stood near the door, too ashamed to move forward and too tired to leave. Noah noticed him and looked from Darren to the television. Without saying anything, the boy walked behind the counter and switched it off. The customer complained that he had been watching, but Noah did not turn it back on. Darren lowered his eyes, unable to thank him. Noah had not defended his career or argued about his mistakes. He had simply decided that Darren should not have to stand there while strangers discussed him as though he were already gone. Darren left the store before anyone else recognized him. He walked for several blocks until he found an old public telephone beside a closed laundromat. Inside his coat was the worn piece of paper containing his mother's number. He knew every digit by memory, but his hands still shook as he dialed. The phone rang twice before Evelyn answered. Darren opened his mouth, but no words came out. He wanted to tell her he was sorry. He wanted to say that he was cold, afraid, and tired of waking up in places where no one knew his name. Most of all, he wanted to ask whether the bedroom at home was still there, and whether she could forgive the years he had stayed away. But shame pressed against his throat, and all Evelyn heard was his uneven breathing. She remained silent for a few seconds. Then she said his name softly, not as a question, but as a mother recognizing the sound of her own child. She did not ask where Darren had been, or why he had never returned her calls. She did not mention the video, though she had already seen it and cried until morning. Instead, she spoke with the same calm voice she had used when he was a frightened boy, waking from a nightmare. "If you cannot come home yet, stay alive for one more day. I will use that day to keep waiting for you." Darren closed his eyes and pressed the phone tightly against his ear. For one moment, he almost told her where he was. He imagined his mother arriving with a warm coat, touching his face, and taking him home. Then he remembered the man in the video, kneeling in dirty water while the world laughed. He could not bear the thought of his mother seeing him that way. Darren slowly placed the receiver back on the hook. He sat beside the laundromat wall and pulled his knees against his chest. Cars moved along the road, and somewhere nearby, his 17-second video continued playing on thousands of screens. The world saw a ruined athlete who had wasted his life. Evelyn had heard only one breath and still recognized her son. Darren covered his face with both hands and cried without making a sound. He was not ready to go home. But for the first time in a long while, he had a reason to survive until morning. Someone was still waiting. Marcus Cole was sitting at the head of a long conference table when his assistant quietly placed a phone beside him. Around the room, lawyers, sponsors, and team executives were discussing a new business deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Marcus had spent months preparing for the meeting, but the moment he saw Darren Wade kneeling in a muddy parking lot, every voice in the room seemed to fade. The video lasted only 17 seconds. Marcus watched it once, then again, pausing when Darren reached into the dirty water to pick up a few coins. No one around the table spoke at first. They all recognized Darren. Years earlier, his photograph had hung throughout the team's arena, and children had worn his jersey to school. Now, his coat was torn, his hands were shaking, and strangers were filming him like he was part of a roadside attraction. One executive finally broke the silence and warned Marcus that getting involved could create a serious public relations problem. Darren had already gone through several failed treatment programs. If he refused help, relapsed, or caused another public incident, the team could be dragged into the story. Others quickly agreed. They suggested releasing a short public statement expressing concern while allowing professional organizations to handle the situation. It would sound responsible, protect the team, and keep Marcus at a safe distance. One advisor reminded him that Darren was no longer under contract and that the organization had no legal responsibility for what happened to him. Marcus listened without interrupting, but he kept looking at the frozen image on the phone. Everyone in the room saw a risk. Marcus saw a man he had once known. He remembered Darren as a young player who stayed after games long after the other athletes had left. Children waited near the tunnel with basketballs, programs, and homemade signs. Security often tried to move them along, but Darren would ask them to stay. He signed every item, especially for the kids standing in the back who were too shy or too small to push forward. Darren once told Marcus that he knew what it felt like to be the child no one noticed. Marcus also remembered the day Darren received his first large professional bonus. Several teammates bought cars and expensive watches. Darren used most of his money to replace the leaking roof on his mother's house. He joked that his mother had spent years placing pots under the ceiling whenever it rained, and she deserved to sleep through a storm without worrying about water falling onto her bed. Darren had handed Marcus a photograph of the finished roof with the pride of someone holding a championship trophy. There were darker memories too. Darren arrived late to practice after nights without sleep. Some days he spoke too quickly and could not sit still. On others, he barely spoke at all. The team treated the problem as inconsistency, bad judgment, and a lack of discipline. Coaches fined him, reporters criticized him, and teammates learned to avoid him when his behavior became unpredictable. Marcus had asked whether Darren needed help, but only in brief conversations between meetings. When Darren said he was fine, Marcus accepted the answer because it was easier for everyone. Looking at the video, Marcus wondered how many warning signs they had ignored because Darren could still score points. As long as he performed under the arena lights, people called him passionate and complicated. Once he could no longer play, the same pain became an inconvenience. The people who had earned money from Darren's talent slowly disappeared when caring for him required more than applause. Marcus realized he had been one of them. He closed the phone and looked around the table. "We will finish this meeting tomorrow," he said. Several executives objected, reminding him that important people had flown across the country to be there. Marcus stood anyway. A business deal could survive a delay. He was no longer sure Darren could. That evening, Marcus returned to his house but did not eat dinner. He went directly to his office and opened an old folder on his computer. Inside was a voicemail he had saved for almost 15 years. He rarely listened to it, but he had never found the courage to delete it. The recording began with the voice of Daniel Harris, Marcus's closest friend from college. Daniel had known Marcus before the private planes, the professional team, and the magazine covers. They had shared a small apartment, borrowed money from each other, and promised that success would never make them strangers. But as Marcus's businesses grew, their calls became shorter and less frequent. Daniel struggled with depression, though he rarely spoke openly about it. Marcus knew his friend was having a difficult year, but he believed there would always be more time to help. On the night of the voicemail, Marcus had been preparing for an important meeting. He saw Daniel's name on his phone, but allowed the call to go unanswered. Daniel left a message saying that he was not doing well and needed someone to talk to. Marcus planned to call him after the meeting. Then another problem came up, followed by another. 3 days later, Daniel died. Marcus had replayed the voicemail hundreds of times over the years. Each time, he imagined a different ending. In some versions, he answered the call and Daniel survived. In others, he left the meeting, drove to his friend's house, and stayed until morning. Marcus knew there was no way to prove that one conversation would have changed everything. But he also knew Daniel had asked him to be present, and Marcus had chosen not to be. Rachel stood outside the office and heard the recording through the partly open door. She was Marcus's 23-year-old daughter, and she had grown up watching her father solve problems with money. When he missed a birthday, he sent an expensive gift. When he could not attend a school event, flowers arrived with an apology written by an assistant. Rachel loved him, but she had learned not to expect him to stay when life became uncomfortable. She entered the room and asked whether Darren reminded him of Daniel. Marcus did not try to deny it. Rachel then asked the harder question, was he trying to help Darren or was he trying to forgive himself? Marcus looked at the old voicemail file on the screen before answering. Maybe both, he said. I cannot return to the night Daniel called me, but I still have a chance not to ignore another man's call for help. Rachel reminded him that Darren had not actually called. Marcus looked again at the image of him kneeling in the rain. Sometimes people stop calling because they no longer believe anyone will answer. For the first time, Rachel did not argue. She saw that her father was not speaking like a billionaire or a team owner. He was speaking like a man who had lived too long with the memory of arriving late. The next morning, Marcus gathered a small group of trusted employees. He instructed them to contact hospitals, shelters, outreach workers, former teammates, and anyone who might have seen Darren recently. They were not to speak with reporters or post anything online. No one was allowed to offer money for photographs or information that could place Darren in danger. The team's public relations director recommended announcing the search before someone else leaked it. A public statement could make Marcus look compassionate and might encourage people to help. Marcus refused. He did not want Darren to see cameras before he saw a familiar face. He did not want a frightened man to believe he had become part of a campaign. There would be no press conference, no photographer waiting beside a hospital bed, and no story about a billionaire rescuing a fallen athlete. Marcus understood that Darren might reject him. He might disappear again. He might accept treatment and later relapse. Helping him would not guarantee a clean or inspiring ending. But Marcus was no longer looking for a perfect ending. He wanted to find Darren while there was still a story left to change. Before leaving the office, Marcus played the 17-second video one final time. Then he paused it before Darren bent toward the puddle. He studied the man's face and tried to see beyond the dirt, exhaustion, and shame. The world was already preparing to remember Darren by the lowest moment of his life. Marcus decided he would not let that moment become the last one. Marcus began the search before sunrise. He called hospitals, homeless shelters, bus terminals, churches, outreach centers, and every former teammate whose number he could find. His staff created a map of places where Darren had reportedly been seen, but most of the information was old or uncertain. A man at a bus station remembered seeing him asleep on a bench several weeks earlier. A shelter worker thought Darren had stayed there for 2 nights, but he had signed in under a different name. Every lead gave Marcus another small piece of the story, yet none of them brought him closer to the man himself. At a public hospital, a nurse remembered Darren immediately. He had arrived with a deep cut on his foot that had become infected after days of walking in wet shoes. The nurse cleaned the wound and tried to convince him to stay for further treatment, but Darren became frightened when she asked for identification. He left before the doctor arrived, still limping badly. Before walking out, he had asked the nurse to give his unopened food tray to an older patient across the hall because the man had no family visiting him. The nurse had not known Darren's name at the time. She only remembered that he seemed more worried about taking up someone else's bed than about losing his foot. Marcus stood quietly beside the hospital desk as the nurse spoke. He imagined Darren walking back into the cold with a bandaged foot because he believed the bed was meant for someone more deserving. For years, people had described Darren as selfish, reckless, and impossible to help. But the trail Marcus was following told a different story. Darren had not stopped caring about other people. He had simply stopped believing that he deserved the same care. At a church shelter, a volunteer recognized Darren from the photograph. She said he had come in several times during the winter, usually after everyone else had already found a place to sleep. On one freezing night, only one bed remained. Darren had been standing in line for nearly an hour when an elderly man arrived, shaking so badly that he could barely speak. Darren gave him the bed and spent the night sitting on the floor near the heating vent. When the volunteer brought him a blanket, he asked her to cover the older man first. The volunteer remembered trying to persuade Darren to stay the following morning so they could help him apply for housing and medical care. Darren thanked her, but left before breakfast. She believed he was ashamed to receive anything he could not repay. As Marcus listened, he began to see how Darren had disappeared so completely. He was not only running from hospitals, shelters, and people who recognized him, he was running from every moment that required him to admit he needed help. Former teammates offered more fragments. One said Darren had called him a year earlier, but hung up before asking for anything. Another admitted that he had stopped answering because every conversation felt difficult and unpredictable. A third had sent money several times but eventually gave up after Darren disappeared again. None of them sounded cruel. Most sounded tired, guilty, and afraid of being pulled into a problem they did not know how to solve. Marcus understood their fear because he had shared it. Helping someone once was easy. Staying through relapse, anger, silence, and broken promises was different. It asked for patience without any guarantee of success. People wanted to believe that rescue happened in one dramatic moment, a check written, a bed offered, a treatment program arranged. But Darren's condition had not been created in a single night, and it would not disappear after one act of kindness. By afternoon, Marcus's staff had collected dozens of reports, but Darren remained missing. Several sightings turned out to be different men. Others were days old. A few people tried to sell photographs or demanded money before revealing information. Marcus refused. He knew that announcing a reward could turn Darren into something people hunted instead of someone they protected. The search continued into the evening. Marcus had not eaten since morning, and his phone had barely left his hand. Each time it rang, he expected someone to say Darren had been found. Instead, the calls ended with the same words. He was here, but he left. Those words began to weigh on him. Darren had been everywhere, yet nowhere long enough for anyone to hold on to him. At the gas station, Noah saw a news report about the search. The station displayed a telephone number for anyone who had recently seen Darren. Noah watched the short video again and recognized the jacket, the damaged shoe, and the place where the coins had landed. He also noticed that the report showed none of what happened afterward. It did not show Darren giving away half his food or holding his mother's photograph while he slept beneath the awning. Noah asked Mr. Harris if he could use the store phone. The owner studied the boy's face, then handed it to him without asking questions. Noah dialed the number and was connected to one of Marcus's assistants. At first, the assistant assumed the caller was another person offering an unreliable sighting. But Noah spoke carefully and described the exact place Darren usually sat, the times he arrived, and the way he moved farther into the shadows whenever police cars passed. Marcus took the phone himself. Noah explained that Darren often returned to the gas station when it rained. The awning was wide enough to keep most of the water away, and Mr. Harris sometimes allowed him to stay after closing. Noah warned Marcus not to arrive with police officers, cameras, or a crowd. Darren was used to being chased from one place to another. If he saw uniforms or bright lights, he would assume he was in trouble and disappear again. Marcus asked how Noah could be sure Darren would return. The boy told him about the sandwich. Darren had promised that someday he would repay it, although Noah had never asked him to. Marcus said that a promise about a sandwich did not seem like much to depend on. Noah was silent for a moment before answering. Maybe it isn't much to you, but when someone has almost nothing left, the small promises may be the only ones he still believes he can keep. The words stayed with Marcus. Noah did not believe Darren would return because he was famous, because people were searching for him, or because help was waiting. He believed Darren would return because he still carried a small debt of kindness in his heart. A man who remembered one sandwich had not forgotten everything. Somewhere beneath the shame and illness, a part of Darren was still trying to remain connected to another person. Marcus asked Noah whether he was afraid of Darren. The boy said he was not. He had seen frightened adults, angry customers, and people who became cruel when they did not get what they wanted. Darren was different. Even when hungry, he moved aside for others. Even when cold, he gave away food. Noah did not think Darren was dangerous. He thought Darren was tired. Before ending the call, Noah gave Marcus one final warning. Please don't talk to him like he's a problem you came to fix. He already thinks everyone would be better without him. Marcus looked around the large office where his employees were still studying maps and making calls. A 12-year-old boy who had known Darren for only a few days understood something the rest of them had missed. Darren did not only need a hospital bed or a treatment program, he needed someone to approach him without making him feel like a burden. That evening, Marcus drove to the gas station with only one assistant. He left the security team several blocks away and instructed them not to approach unless there was an emergency. There were no reporters, no cameras, and no one wearing a uniform. Marcus parked across the street where he could see the awning without frightening anyone who came near it. The rain began shortly after dark. At first, Marcus believed Darren would appear quickly. Noah had said he often came during bad weather, and the night was becoming colder by the hour. But 9 o'clock passed, then 10, then midnight. People entered the gas station, bought coffee and gasoline, and drove away. A few homeless men crossed the parking lot, but none of them was Darren. Marcus's assistant, Thomas, watched the rain collect across the windshield. He suggested they speak to the police or return in the morning with more people. Marcus shook his head. Darren had spent years learning that people eventually stopped waiting. Marcus did not want to become another person who proved him right. Around 1 in the morning, Noah came outside with Mr. Harris. His mother had arrived to take him home, but before leaving, the boy walked across the parking lot and tapped on Marcus's window. He handed him a paper bag containing 2 sandwiches. "One is for him," Noah said. "The other is for you. You look like you haven't eaten either." Marcus tried to give the boy money, but Noah stepped back. "He didn't need to pay me, neither do you." Then the boy returned to his mother's car. Marcus watched them drive away and placed the bag on the empty passenger seat. He thought about how little Noah's family seemed to have, and how naturally the boy shared it. Marcus had spent his entire life believing that money gave him the power to solve problems. Yet the person who had reached Darren first was a child with 1 sandwich and enough patience not to ask for anything in return. The hours continued to pass. The rain struck the car roof in a steady rhythm. Thomas fell asleep for a while, but Marcus remained awake, watching every figure who appeared near the station. He thought about Daniel's voicemail and the meeting he had once decided was too important to leave. He remembered telling himself he would call in the morning. Morning had come, but the opportunity had not waited. Shortly after 3, Thomas woke and again suggested they return later. Darren might not come. The information could be wrong, and Marcus had another important meeting in only a few hours. Marcus looked toward the dark space beneath the gas station awning. "Once before, I believed a person could wait until morning. I was wrong." He did not say anything else. At 4 o'clock, the temperature dropped further. The windows fogged, and the coffee in the cup holder went cold. Marcus opened Noah's paper bag and ate half of 1 sandwich. He left the other half wrapped carefully beside Darren's untouched meal. For years, Marcus had been surrounded by people who waited for him. Employees waited outside meetings, drivers waited beside cars, and entire rooms became silent when he began speaking. That night, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, Marcus understood what it meant to wait for someone who had no power, no money, and nothing to offer in return. Dawn was still more than an hour away when movement appeared near an abandoned building across the parking lot. A thin man stepped out of the darkness, keeping close to the wall. He wore a faded jacket and walked with a limp, one hand holding his damaged shoe together. Marcus leaned forward but did not leave the car. Darren had finally returned. He was walking toward the awning, unaware that someone had spent the entire night waiting for him. And for once, the person waiting had no intention of leaving. Dawn was still an hour away when Darren stepped out from behind the abandoned building across from the gas station. He moved close to the wall, as if the darkness could hide him from the rest of the city. His coat was soaked, his shoulders were bent, and he limped each time his right foot touched the ground. One hand held the loose sole of his shoe in place. The other stayed pressed against the inside of his coat, protecting the few things he still owned. Marcus recognized him immediately and stepped out of the car into the rain. When Marcus called his name, Darren stopped. For one brief moment, his back straightened, almost as if he had heard an arena announcer introduce him before a game. Years earlier, thousands of people had shouted that same name beneath bright lights. Now it came from one man standing alone in an empty parking lot. The memory passed quickly. Fear returned to Darren's face, and he turned toward the alley as if preparing to disappear again. Marcus did not chase him. He understood that Darren had spent years being driven away from sidewalks, stores, hospitals, and shelters. Running after him would only make him feel trapped. Marcus remained beside the car, leaving enough distance for Darren to decide whether to stay. He explained calmly that there were no police officers, reporters, or cameras waiting nearby. Darren slowly looked back, but suspicion remained in his eyes. The world had already taken the most humiliating moment of his life and turned it into entertainment. Darren could not believe that a billionaire had come looking for him without wanting something in return. He assumed Marcus wanted a photograph beside the fallen athlete, a public moment of kindness that would make everyone praise the wealthy team owner while Darren remained someone else's problem. Marcus listened without defending himself. Then he switched off his phone, placed it on the roof of the car, and opened the passenger door. Warm air escaped into the cold parking lot. On the seat was the paper bag Noah had prepared, with a sandwich still wrapped inside. Marcus did not ask Darren to enter treatment, promise sobriety, or prove that he was ready to change. He knew Darren had probably heard those demands before. Too often, people offered help only after asking someone in pain to guarantee that they would never fail again. Marcus kept one hand on the open door and said, "I cannot promise that tomorrow will be easy, but if you get into this car, you will not have to sleep in the rain tonight." The offer was small, but that was what made it feel real. Marcus was not promising to repair Darren's entire life. He was offering warmth, food, and one night away from the street. Darren stared at the open door for a long time. He wanted to believe the offer, but experience had taught him that kindness usually disappeared when he became difficult, frightened, or disappointing. His voice was barely louder than the rain when he finally asked, "What happens when I disappoint you?" Marcus understood that Darren was not asking about the drive. He was asking about every friend, doctor, teammate, and family member who had tried to help before becoming exhausted. He was asking how long this door would remain open once Marcus saw how damaged he truly was. Marcus answered, "Then we face that day when it comes. Tonight, you do not have to prove anything." Darren lowered his eyes. For several moments, neither man moved. Then Darren began walking toward the car. Each step was slow and painful. When he reached the passenger door, he looked down at his muddy shoes and the spotless interior. Without saying anything, he bent down and began removing them. Marcus watched Darren place one shoe beside the curb. Even while freezing, hungry, and injured, he was afraid that his presence might damage something expensive. Somewhere during his years on the street, Darren had begun to believe that his dirt, his pain, and even his body did not belong in clean places. Marcus bent down, picked up both muddy shoes, and placed them on the floor inside the car. Dirt stained his hands and coat, but he did not hesitate. "The car can be cleaned," Marcus said. "You cannot be replaced." Darren looked at him without speaking. He had been called talented, difficult, unstable, reckless, and disappointing. He could not remember the last time someone had spoken as though losing him would matter. His face tightened as he tried to hold back tears, but Marcus did not look away or rush him. After several seconds, Darren climbed into the car. He sat near the edge of the seat, careful not to let his wet clothes touch too much of the clean leather. Marcus placed Noah's sandwich in his lap, closed the door gently, and returned to the driver's seat. He did not ask where Darren had been, how he had lost his money, or why he had rejected help before. He simply started the engine and drove away from the gas station. Darren kept one hand wrapped around the door handle. He watched the mirrors and looked behind them whenever another car approached. Each traffic light seemed to make him tense, as though he expected police officers, reporters, or someone waiting to drag him away. Marcus noticed, but did not tell him to relax. He understood that safety could not be explained in a few words. Darren's body would have to learn it slowly. After several blocks, Darren opened the paper bag and saw the sandwich. When he realized Noah had sent it, his expression softened. He ate half, then carefully wrapped the rest and returned it to his coat. Marcus said nothing. He now understood that Darren saved food, not because he was ungrateful, but because part of him still believed every meal might be his last. The heater slowly warmed the car. Darren's grip on the door handle loosened, though he still fought to keep his eyes open. Sleeping on the street had taught him that closing his eyes could mean losing his shoes, food, or the small space he had found for the night. Even inside the car, his body remained prepared for danger. Marcus turned off the radio and said quietly, "You can rest. I will keep driving." Darren looked at him for a moment. He seemed to be searching Marcus's face for some sign that the offer would later be used against him. Finding none, he leaned back against the seat. His eyes closed, opened again, then finally stayed shut. A few minutes later, his fingers released the door handle. Marcus slowed the car and avoided the roughest streets. Darren's face looked different in sleep. The fear had not disappeared, but it had loosened its hold. For a moment, Marcus could see the young athlete he remembered, the player who made teammates laugh and remained after games to sign something for every child still waiting. Marcus knew that one open car door would not repair Darren's life. There would be treatment, fear, anger, and perhaps more moments when Darren tried to run. He might reject help or break promises. There was no guarantee that the story ahead would be simple or beautiful. But none of that changed what mattered that morning. Darren was no longer standing alone in the rain. For the first time in years, he slept while another person remained awake, watched the road, and carried him somewhere safe. The sky was beginning to lighten when Marcus pulled into the parking lot of a small all-night diner. It was the kind of place where truck drivers stopped for coffee and night shift workers ate breakfast before going home. Marcus could have taken Darren to an expensive hotel or arranged a private room somewhere else, but he did not want Darren to feel watched. The diner was warm, quiet, and ordinary. For someone who had spent years being treated like a public problem, ordinary felt safer. Darren hesitated at the entrance. He looked down at his wet clothes and muddy shoes, then watched a waitress carry plates between the tables. Marcus could see that he was preparing to step away. Darren had been removed from enough restaurants and stores to expect the same thing here. Marcus walked inside first and chose a booth near the back where Darren could sit against the wall and keep the entrance in sight. Darren slid into the corner of the booth. His shoulders remained tense and his eyes followed every person who entered. When the waitress approached, he lowered his head as though he expected her to ask him to leave. Instead, she placed 2 menus on the table and poured coffee for Marcus. She did not stare at Darren's torn clothes or ask questions. That small act of normalcy seemed to confuse him more than open cruelty would have. Marcus ordered eggs, potatoes, bacon, and toast for both of them. When the plates arrived, Darren stared at the food before touching it. Then hunger took over. He ate quickly, barely chewing, as though someone might remove the plate before he finished. His fork scraped against the dish, and his breathing became uneven. Marcus did not tell him to slow down. He understood that Darren was not eating like a man enjoying breakfast. He was eating like someone trying to survive an uncertain window of safety. Halfway through the meal, Darren glanced toward the waitress. When he believed no one was watching, he wrapped several slices of toast in a napkin and slipped them into his coat. The movement was quick and practiced. Darren immediately looked across the table, and shame appeared on his face when he realized Marcus had seen him. Marcus did not ask him to return the bread. He did not pretend not to notice either. He simply called the waitress and ordered another complete meal to go. When the bag arrived, Marcus placed it beside Darren. "This one is for later," he said. "You do not have to hide it." Darren looked at the paper bag, then at the bread inside his coat. Slowly, he removed the napkin and placed it on the table. His hands began to shake. For years, people had treated his survival habits as proof that something was wrong with him. They saw him hoarding food, sleeping near exits, or refusing to put down his belongings. But no one asked what had taught him to live that way. Darren admitted that he could no longer remember when he started hiding food. Perhaps it began at the bus station, where anything left beside him could disappear while he slept. Perhaps it was during a winter when a shelter ran out of meals before his turn came. After enough hungry nights, he stopped trusting that food would still be there later. Even when a full plate sat in front of him, part of his mind was already preparing for tomorrow. Marcus could have asked how a man who once earned millions ended up afraid of losing a few slices of toast. He could have asked about the money, the people who left, or the treatment programs Darren had walked away from. But those questions had already been asked by strangers who wanted explanations more than they wanted to understand him. Instead, Marcus asked when Darren had last finished a meal without worrying about where the next one would come from. Darren opened his mouth, but no answer came. He looked down at the plate and searched through years of memories. There had been meals in shelters, food from strangers, and scraps eaten alone at bus stations. Even before he became homeless, he had spent years moving through life with the same fear. During his playing days, he worried that one bad season would end his career. After his career ended, he worried that every friend, every room, and every promise would disappear. "I don't remember," he finally said. The words were quiet, but they carried more weight than a long confession. Darren covered his face with both hands. His shoulders began to shake. He was not crying because the food tasted good, or because Marcus had paid for it. He was crying because someone had finally seen the fear behind something that made him feel ashamed. Marcus remained silent. He did not reach across the table or tell Darren that everything would be all right. He knew some pain became heavier when people rushed to cover it with hopeful words. He stayed where he was and allowed Darren to cry without having to apologize. After a while, Darren lowered his hands. He looked exhausted, but something in his face had softened. He reached into the deepest pocket of his coat and removed a small bundle wrapped in damp paper. Inside was the half sandwich Noah had given him the night before. The bread was soaked and the cheese had gone cold. It was no longer safe to eat, yet Darren had carried it through the rain. Marcus asked why he had kept it. Darren explained that Noah's sandwich was the first thing anyone had given him in years, without demanding a promise in return. The boy had not asked Darren to become sober, tell his story, or prove that he deserved help. He had simply noticed a hungry man and brought him food. Darren held the ruined sandwich carefully, as though it were more valuable than anything else he owned. "People usually want something," he said, "even when they say they don't." Marcus understood that Darren was not speaking only about food. Every offer of help had come with conditions, deadlines, disappointment, or the fear that his failure would be used as proof that he had never deserved help at all. Darren had learned that kindness could be withdrawn without warning. Noah's sandwich mattered because, for one brief moment, kindness had asked nothing from him. Marcus realized then that money would be the easiest part of helping Darren. He could pay for meals, medical care, a hotel room, or the best treatment center in the country. But none of those things could immediately teach Darren to trust an open hand. That would take time, patience, and many small moments in which help was offered without humiliation. Before they left, Darren carefully placed Noah's sandwich back inside its wrapper. Marcus did not tell him to throw it away. To anyone else, it was spoiled food. To Darren, It was evidence that he had not been completely invisible. The waitress brought the bill, and Marcus paid without drawing attention to himself. Darren picked up the meal Marcus had ordered to go, but before leaving the booth, he returned the hidden slices of toast to the plate. He no longer needed to steal food from a meal that had already been given to him. Outside, the rain had nearly stopped. Darren stood beside the car, holding the paper bag close to his chest. It was only breakfast and one extra meal. It did not solve his illness or erase the years he had spent alone. But for the first time in a long while, Darren knew there would be food waiting for him later. And for someone who had stopped trusting tomorrow, that was a small reason to believe it might still come. Marcus rented Darren a quiet hotel room away from the main entrance, where reporters or curious strangers were unlikely to notice him. The room was warm, clean, and ordinary, but Darren stopped at the doorway as if he were entering somewhere dangerous. Before setting down his bag, he looked beneath the bed, pulled back the curtains, checked the bathroom, and opened every closet. He tested the windows twice and watched the hallway through the small opening in the door. Years on the street had taught him that safety could disappear the moment he stopped paying attention. Marcus did not tell Darren that he was being unreasonable. He waited until the search was finished, then placed the room key in Darren's hand. He showed him the lock and explained that once the door was secured from the inside, no one could enter unless Darren chose to let them in. To Marcus, it was a basic feature of a hotel room. To Darren, it meant something much greater. For the first time in years, he had control over a door. He could decide who came close and who remained outside. Darren placed his few belongings beside the wall, but he would not sit on the bed. The sheets were bright white, and the pillows looked untouched. He stared at them with the discomfort of someone looking at something that belonged to a better kind of person. Instead, he took a blanket from the closet and spread it across the floor. Marcus understood without asking. Darren was afraid his wet clothes, unwashed body, and damaged shoes would stain the bed. Even after being invited into the room, he still felt that he had to take up as little space as possible. Marcus sat on the floor beside him. He did not order Darren to move or remind him how much the room cost. After a quiet moment, he said, "The bed does not need you to prove that you deserve it. It is there because you are tired." Darren kept his eyes on the floor. The words were kind, but kindness was still difficult for him to trust. Marcus left a clean shirt, bottled water, and the extra meal from the diner on the table. Before leaving, he reminded Darren that he could lock the door and call at any hour. Darren nodded, though neither man knew whether he would believe that promise when the night became difficult. After Marcus left, Darren locked the door, checked it again, and returned to the blanket on the floor. He tried to eat, but could manage only a few bites. The room was too quiet. On the streets, engines, footsteps, sirens, and shouting warned him when danger was approaching. Here, there was nothing but the low sound of the heater and his own breathing. Without the noise of the city, memories began to return. He remembered people telling him that he had wasted his talent. He remembered hospital rooms, broken promises, and the disappointment in voices that had once spoken his name with pride. He heard the crowd from his playing days, then the laughter from the gas station when strangers watched the video of him kneeling in the mud. The silence did not bring peace. It gave every painful thought more room. Darren remained on the floor, but after a while, he reached up and pulled one pillow from the bed. He held it tightly against his chest. The gesture made him look less like a former professional athlete and more like a frightened child trying to survive the night. Shortly before 3 a.m, Marcus's phone rang. Darren did not explain what was wrong. He only admitted that he could not sleep and asked Marcus not to end the call. Marcus did not give advice or tell him to be strong. He began talking about ordinary things. He told Darren how he had failed his first driving test by hitting a traffic cone, how he once ruined an entire dinner because he forgot food was cooking, and how his childhood dog used to hide beneath the kitchen table during thunderstorms. The stories had no lesson. That was why they helped. Marcus was not trying to repair Darren. He was simply reminding him that someone was still there. As Marcus spoke, Darren's breathing slowly became quieter. He stopped answering, but Marcus kept the phone beside him and listened until he was certain Darren had fallen asleep. On the hotel floor, Darren still held the pillow against his chest. The door was locked, the food remained on the table, and no one was coming to take either of them away. Rachel found her father sitting alone in the kitchen before sunrise, the phone still connected beside him. She had seen Marcus donate large sums of money and solve difficult problems with a single call. But this was different. There was no audience and nothing to gain. He had stayed awake for hours because a frightened man had asked him not to leave. Rachel quietly placed a cup of coffee beside her father. For the first time, she understood that Marcus was not only paying for a room, he was giving Darren something money could not buy, a person who remained on the other end of the line until morning. Marcus visited Evelyn the next afternoon. She lived alone in a small house on a quiet street, far from the bright lights and noise of the city. The roof was newer than the rest of the house, the same roof Darren had paid to replace with his first professional bonus. Evelyn opened the door slowly, holding the frame for support. She did not ask whether Marcus had brought good news. After years of disappointment, she had learned to protect herself from hope. Darren's childhood bedroom was at the end of the hallway. His first basketball jersey still hung inside the closet, and a pair of worn sneakers rested beneath the bed. The walls were covered with photographs from before the fame, before the injuries, and before Darren learned to smile whenever a camera appeared. In those pictures, he was only a boy with scraped knees and a basketball beneath one arm. Evelyn had kept the room almost exactly the same. She was afraid that if her son ever returned and found everything changed, he might believe there was no place left for him. On the kitchen table sat one empty chair. Evelyn told Marcus that every year on Darren's birthday, she cooked his favorite meal and set a plate for him. Most years, the food grew cold before she finally put it away. She knew he probably would not come, but she could not stop waiting. "I'm afraid the first year I stop setting his place will be the year he finally finds the courage to come home." Marcus looked at the untouched chair and understood that Darren had not suffered alone. His disappearance had left his mother living between grief and hope, never knowing whether to mourn him or keep the porch light on. Every unknown number made her heart race. Every late-night call filled her with fear before she even answered. Darren had been wandering through streets and shelters, while Evelyn had been trapped in a different kind of waiting. Marcus called the hotel and handed Evelyn the phone. When Darren heard his mother's voice, he could not speak. He had prepared apologies in his mind for years, but none of them felt large enough. Evelyn did not ask where he had been or why he had stayed away. She asked whether he was indoors, what he had eaten, and whether the wound on his foot still hurt. Those ordinary questions broke through Darren's shame. He had believed he needed to return with money, clean clothes, and an explanation that could repair the past. His mother needed none of those things. She only needed to know her son had eaten, that he was warm, and that he was still alive. Darren finally whispered that he was sorry. Evelyn closed her eyes and held the phone tighter. "You can explain the lost years when you are ready. Today, I only need to know there may still be years left for us." Darren covered his face and cried. He was still not ready to go home, but for the first time, he understood that home had not closed its door. His mother was not waiting for the famous player he used to be. She was waiting for her son. Evelyn arrived at the hotel carrying a small bag of clean clothes and a container of the soup Darren had loved since childhood. She had made it early that morning, then reheated it twice because her hands were shaking too much to leave the house. Marcus walked her to the hallway but stopped several doors away. He knew this was not a moment that needed witnesses. Inside the room, Darren heard his mother's footsteps before she reached the door. He knew the sound immediately. Years had passed, but some memories lived deeper than time. When he was a boy, those same footsteps had crossed the hallway whenever he woke from a nightmare. Back then, he only had to call once, and she would come. Now she was standing only a few feet away, and Darren could not move. He looked at himself in the mirror. His face was hollow, his hair was tangled, and his hands would not stop trembling. There were wounds on his feet, stains on his clothes, and years of pain in his eyes. He had imagined seeing his mother again many times, but in every version, he came home looking stronger. He would be clean, sober, and ready with the right words. He would explain everything, ask for forgiveness, and somehow become her son again. He had never imagined meeting her while he still looked like someone who needed to be saved. Evelyn knocked once and softly said his name. Darren placed one hand on the lock, but shame held him there. He was not afraid that she would be angry. Anger would have been easier. He was afraid her eyes would change when she saw him. He could survive strangers laughing at him and reporters replaying his worst moment. He did not know if he could survive seeing pity on his mother's face. Evelyn waited, but Darren did not open the door. She did not knock again or ask him to be brave. She set the clothes and soup on the floor, then slowly lowered herself beside the door. Her knees hurt, and it took her several seconds to sit, but she stayed there. She began talking about home. The garden had grown wild because she could no longer bend down long enough to pull the weeds. The kitchen faucet still leaked, and the porch light had burned out twice that year. She told him the soup was probably too salty, just as it had been when he was 10, and pretended to like it so she would not feel bad. Her voice was calm, almost ordinary. She spoke as though Darren were not a grown man hiding in a hotel room, but a frightened child sitting on the other side of his bedroom door. Darren slowly lowered himself to the floor. Their backs rested against the same piece of wood. Only a few inches separated them, but between those inches lived years of missed birthdays, unanswered calls, sleepless nights, and apologies Darren had never found the courage to say. He listened to his mother describe the house he had been too ashamed to return to. Nothing in her voice asked him to explain himself. She was simply reminding him that the house still existed and that his place inside it had not been erased. After a long silence, Darren finally spoke. His voice was barely strong enough to pass through the door. He told her that everything was gone: his career, his money, his friends, and the man he thought he was supposed to become. He said the son she once loved no longer existed. Evelyn closed her eyes and placed one hand against the door. "I did not come here looking for the man on the posters," she said. "I came for the little boy who used to hold my hand so tightly when we crossed the street. I know he is still there, because a mother does not forget the hand of her own child." Darren lifted his trembling hand and placed it against the same spot from the other side. The door was cold between them, but he imagined the warmth of her palm. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to remember what it felt like to be someone's son instead of someone's disappointment. Evelyn remained there without asking him to open the door. She understood that love could not always pull someone out by force. Sometimes love had to sit quietly on the other side and wait until fear became a little smaller. After several minutes, she told Darren she would leave the clothes and soup outside. She promised not to be angry if he could not see her that day. Then she slowly stood and began walking away. The sound of her footsteps moving down the hallway reached Darren like another goodbye. He remembered all the times she had called and he had not answered. All the nights she had waited beside the window. All the birthdays when she had placed an extra plate on the table, knowing the food would grow cold. Before Evelyn reached the end of the hallway, the door opened a few inches. She stopped. Darren remained hidden behind it. He still could not show her his face, but one hand reached through the narrow opening. His fingers were thin and shaking. Evelyn walked back without speaking. She took his hand in both of hers and held it as carefully as if she were holding something that had been lost for years. She pressed his hand against her cheek. It was the same hand she had held on his first day of school, the same hand that once carried a basketball everywhere he went, the same hand that had signed thousands of autographs and later searched through muddy water for coins. To Evelyn, it was still her son's hand. Darren began to cry behind the door. Evelyn cried with him, but neither tried to hide it. There was still a wall between them, and the years they had lost could not be repaired in one moment. Darren was still frightened, still ashamed, and still far from ready to come home. But this time, when love came close, he did not run. He opened the door just enough to reach for his mother. And she was still there to take his hand. The morning after Evelyn's visit, Marcus returned to the hotel with information about a recovery center in Florida. It specialized in addiction, trauma, and mental health treatment. The center was quiet, private, and prepared to accept Darren immediately. Marcus had already arranged transportation and offered to cover every expense. To Marcus, it seemed like the next necessary step. To Darren, it sounded like another prison. The moment Marcus mentioned treatment, Darren's body became tense. His eyes moved toward the door, and his hands began to shake. He remembered previous hospital stays where strangers had taken his clothes, locked doors behind him, and spoken about him in hallways as though he could not hear. Doctors had used words he did not understand. Security guards had stood nearby whenever he became frightened. People discussed his symptoms, his risks, and his failures, but few had asked what he needed in order to feel safe. Darren remembered pressing his face against a small hospital window and begging to leave. He remembered being told that everything was being done for his own good, while feeling that he no longer owned his body or his choices. Those memories had followed him long after the doors reopened. He looked at Marcus and saw not a friend offering help, but another person preparing to take control. Darren accused Marcus of growing tired of him. He believed the hotel room, the meals, and the phone calls had only been temporary. Now that the situation had become complicated, Marcus wanted to send him somewhere far away and let professionals deal with the damage. Marcus allowed Darren to finish. He did not tell him that everything would be fine. He did not promise the center would remove his pain or that recovery would happen quickly. Marcus knew false hope would only become another broken promise. "Treatment will be difficult," he said. "You may feel angry, frightened, or ready to leave. Money cannot make those feelings disappear. But this is not a place I am sending you because I am tired of you. It is a place where people can stay beside you when caring is not enough." Darren turned away. He wanted to believe Marcus, but fear spoke more loudly. Every open door seemed temporary. Every person who said they would stay eventually discovered how exhausting he could be. Darren believed it was only a matter of time before Marcus reached the same conclusion. While Marcus stepped into the hallway to speak with a doctor, Darren gathered his photograph, the faded telephone number, and the wristband from his final game. He left the clean clothes behind. He did not take the extra food or the room key. Within minutes, he was gone. Darren walked for hours until he returned to the gas station. The awning was wet, the pavement was cold, and the same flickering light shone above the place where he had slept. Nothing there had improved, yet sitting against the brick wall felt strangely familiar. Pain he already understood seemed safer than help he might lose. At the hotel, Marcus discovered the empty room. For a moment, panic rose inside him. His staff wanted to contact the police and begin another citywide search, but Marcus stopped them. He remembered Noah's warning. Darren would not return to a place where he felt hunted. Marcus called the gas station. Noah found Darren before sunset. The boy did not ask why he had run or remind him that people were trying to help. He sat several feet away beneath the awning and shared the silence. Darren stared at the passing cars and held the old wristband in his hand. After a while, Noah asked whether Darren had returned because the gas station was where he belonged or because it was the place where he had learned how to hurt without expecting anything better. The question stayed between them. Darren looked at the wet sidewalk, the trash near the curb, and the corner where he had once hidden from the wind. He had called the place safe because it never surprised him. It was always cold. People usually ignored him. Nothing there asked him to hope. But perhaps a place was not safe simply because a person already knew how much it would hurt. Darren told Noah that the recovery center had locked doors and doctors who might try to control him. He admitted that part of him wanted help, but another part was terrified that once he entered, he would disappear behind another label. He did not want to become a diagnosis, a charity case, or a story Marcus could tell about the man he had saved. Noah listened without trying to convince him. Darren turned the wristband over in his palm. The faded fabric had once carried his jersey number and the colors of the team. He had worn it during his final professional game, when he still believed his life would be measured by applause, contracts, and points on a scoreboard. Now, it was the last object connecting him to the person he had been before everything fell apart. Darren asked Noah to keep it. He was afraid that if he remained on the street, hunger or desperation would eventually make him sell it. The wristband was worth almost nothing to anyone else, but Darren knew he would feel as though he had sold the final proof that another version of him had once existed. Noah opened the small metal box where he kept the money he earned selling newspapers. There were only a few folded bills and coins inside. He placed the wristband beneath them and closed the lid carefully. "I'll keep it until you come back," Noah said. Darren asked what would happen if that took years. Noah held the box against his chest. "Then it will wait longer." The answer affected Darren more than Noah understood. Darren had spent years believing that everything had an expiration date: patience, love, second chances, and even the right to return. Yet this boy was willing to guard a worn piece of fabric without knowing when or whether its owner would come back. Darren looked toward the city as evening settled over the parking lot. He thought about his mother sitting outside the hotel door. He thought about Marcus wading through the rain and remaining on the phone until morning. He thought about the sandwich Noah had given without asking him to become someone better first. Perhaps entering treatment did not mean surrendering his life to strangers. Perhaps it meant trusting that the people waiting outside would still remember his name. Darren called Marcus from the gas station phone. He did not apologize for running. He did not promise sobriety, success, or a perfect recovery. He knew those promises would be too large to carry. He said only that he would return to the hotel. When Marcus arrived, Darren was standing beneath the awning without the cardboard sign. His hands were empty. Noah remained beside him, holding the metal box. Marcus did not ask Darren to explain himself. He opened the car door and waited. Before getting in, Darren looked back at the gas station. It had protected him from rain, but it had also become a place where he could slowly disappear without anyone expecting more from him. He understood that leaving it would not make him brave. He was still frightened. He still believed he might fail. But courage was not the absence of fear. Sometimes, courage was simply walking toward a door while every part of you wanted to run. Darren entered the car and told Marcus he was willing to go to Florida. He could not promise to complete treatment or become the man everyone remembered. He made only one promise. He would walk through the recovery center's front door before deciding that he could not stay. For Darren, it was not a promise to change his entire life. It was a promise to give his life one more chance. Darren left Dallas early the next morning with one small bag and the clothes Marcus had bought for him. There were no reporters at the airport, no team representatives, and no crowd waiting to watch him leave. Marcus had arranged everything quietly because Darren did not need another public moment. He needed the chance to begin without feeling that the whole world was waiting to see whether he would fail. The airport made Darren uneasy. Years earlier, he had moved through terminals surrounded by teammates, security guards, and fans asking for pictures. Now he kept his head down and stayed close to Marcus. He was afraid someone would recognize him from the video rather than from the years he had played basketball. Every time a phone was lifted nearby, his shoulders tightened. While they waited near the gate, an older airport employee stopped and looked closely at Darren. Darren prepared himself for a question about the gas station or the money he had lost. He expected pity, judgment, or curiosity. Instead, the man reached into his wallet and removed an old photograph. The picture showed a father and a young boy sitting high in a basketball arena. Both were wearing Darren's jersey. The boy was smiling so widely that his eyes were almost closed. The employee explained that his son had been seriously ill. During one difficult year, he saved enough money to take the boy to a game. Darren had played well that night, but the father remembered something that happened after the final buzzer more clearly than the score. His son had waited near the tunnel with a basketball, too weak and too shy to push through the other children. Darren noticed him standing at the back, walked over, signed the ball, and stayed for a picture. The boy died the following year. The father kept the photograph because that game had been one of the last nights when his son forgot that he was sick. For a few hours, he had simply been a child watching his favorite player. Darren looked at the photograph for a long time. He had no memory of signing that particular ball. During his career, he had met thousands of children and posed for more pictures than he could count. Yet a moment Darren had forgotten had become a memory another family carried through grief. The older man did not mention the viral video. He did not ask Darren to explain what had happened to him. He only thanked him for giving his son one happy night. After the man walked away, Darren sat in silence. For years, he had believed the worst part of his life had erased everything good that came before it. The arrests, the illness, and the image of him kneeling in muddy water had become the only things he could see when he thought of himself. But somewhere, an old photograph still showed a sick child smiling because Darren had noticed him. He had made mistakes that could not be undone. He had hurt people who loved him and disappeared when they tried to help. But he had also been kind in moments he no longer remembered. The man he had become did not completely erase the man he had once been. On the plane, Darren sat by the window and watched Dallas grow smaller beneath the clouds. He thought about his mother's house, Noah's metal box, and the gas station awning where he had learned to expect nothing. Part of him felt relieved to leave. Another part wanted to ask the pilot to turn around. The recovery center frightened him because it represented a future he could not control. On the street, Darren knew how to survive 1 hour at a time. Treatment would ask him to remember things he had spent years trying to forget. It would ask him to trust strangers, follow routines, and remain in one place when every instinct told him to run. Darren finally asked Marcus what would happen if he failed. Marcus did not tell him that failure was impossible. He did not promise that Darren would complete the program or never relapse again. Instead, he reminded him that recovery was not a basketball game. There would be no final buzzer, no scoreboard, and no single moment that declared Darren a winner or a loser. Some days, winning may mean finishing a meal, Marcus said. Some days, it may mean calling someone before the pain makes the decision for you. And sometimes, winning is simply staying when you want to run. Darren looked through the window. He had spent most of his life measuring himself by numbers, points, contracts, wins, minutes played, and money earned. When those numbers disappeared, he believed his value had disappeared with them. The idea of a life without a scoreboard felt strange, but it also brought a small sense of relief. Perhaps one bad day did not have to mean the whole season was over. When they arrived in Florida, a car drove them away from the airport and toward the recovery center. The building was smaller than Darren expected. There were no high walls or guards at the entrance. A garden stood beside the main path, and several residents were sitting beneath a tree. Still, Darren stopped outside the front door. His body became tense, and his breathing grew shallow. The small bag felt heavy in his hand. Memories of locked hospital rooms returned, along with the feeling of strangers deciding what would happen to him. The entrance was only a few steps away, but Darren felt as though he were standing at the edge of something enormous. Marcus remained beside him without touching his arm or trying to guide him forward. He had promised Darren that walking through the door would be his choice. Pulling him inside would turn the center into another place where Darren had lost control. Minutes passed. People entered and left the building, but no one stared. A staff member opened the door, greeted Darren by name, and then stepped back. There was no pressure in her voice. She simply made space for him. Darren looked behind him at the road. The car was still parked nearby. He could leave, return to the airport, and find his way back to the familiar streets of Dallas. The thought brought comfort for only a moment. Then he remembered Noah's question. Had he returned to the gas station because he belonged there, or because he had grown used to hurting there? Darren lifted his bag. He took one step, then another, until he reached the entrance. Before crossing fully, he turned toward Marcus. The fear in his face made him look younger, almost like a child checking whether his parent would still be there after the door closed. Marcus handed him a simple phone. It contained only 3 saved numbers: Evelyn's, Marcus's, and the center's emergency line. "I may not always know what to say," Marcus told him, "but when you call, I will answer." Darren held the phone tightly. He did not ask Marcus to promise that everything would work out. He had learned that no one could make that promise honestly. What mattered was that someone had promised to remain reachable when the difficult days came. Darren stepped through the entrance. The door closed gently behind him, but it did not lock. Marcus remained outside for several minutes, watching through the glass until Darren disappeared down the hallway with a staff member. There was no applause, no celebration, and no crowd calling his name. Only a frightened man walking into treatment by his own choice. For most people, it would have looked like a very small step. For Darren, it was the bravest walk of his life. The first days at the recovery center were harder than Darren had imagined. His body was exhausted, but sleep would not come. Whenever he closed his eyes, he heard the noise of the streets, the laughter from the viral video, and the voices of people who had told him he had wasted his life. He paced the room until morning, checking the lock again and again. Even though the door could be opened from the inside, the sound of it closing made him feel trapped. More than once, he pulled it open just to make sure he still could. Darren refused to attend group therapy. He did not want to sit in a circle while strangers studied his face and waited for him to explain how he had fallen so far. He ate alone and hid bread beneath his mattress, even though meals were served 3 times a day. When staff members entered the hallway, he watched them closely, expecting someone to tell him he had broken a rule. Every kind gesture made him suspicious. Darren had learned that help often came with patience at first, followed by disappointment when he did not improve quickly enough. On the 4th night, a panic attack hit without warning. Someone closed a door at the end of the hallway, and the sound brought back memories of a hospital where Darren had once been held against his will. His chest tightened. The room seemed to shrink around him. A staff member approached slowly and tried to speak with him, but Darren could no longer understand the words. He grabbed a drinking glass from the table and threw it against the wall. The glass shattered. The sound ended the panic almost immediately. Darren stared at the broken pieces scattered across the floor, then lowered himself among them. His anger disappeared and was replaced by shame. He believed he had proven what everyone already thought, that he was dangerous, ungrateful, and impossible to help. He waited for security to arrive. He expected to be told to pack his belongings and leave. Instead, 2 staff members quietly entered the room. One asked Darren to remain still so he would not cut himself. The other swept up the broken glass. No one shouted. No one threatened him. When they finished, they placed a plastic cup on the table and left the door partly open. Darren stared at the cup for a long time. The gesture was so small that most people would not have noticed it. But to Darren, it meant he was still allowed to be thirsty after making a mistake. He had not lost his room, his meals, or his place at the center. For most of his life, every failure had seemed to cost him something: his career, his friendships, his family's trust, or another chance. The plastic cup was the first sign that perhaps a mistake did not always have to end with abandonment. The next morning, Darren closed his door and refused to come out. Around noon, he heard someone sit down in the hallway. The person did not knock or ask Darren to attend therapy. He simply began telling a story about an old fishing boat with a broken engine. The man's name was Samuel Reed. He was 67 years old and had been at the center for several months. Samuel spoke slowly, describing how he had once bought the boat because his daughter loved the water. They planned to repair it together, but he kept delaying the work. By the time he finally opened the toolbox, years had passed, the wood had rotted, and his daughter no longer came to visit. The following day, Samuel returned and sat outside Darren's door again. This time, he talked about a small garden he had planted with his daughter when she was 8. She had chosen tomatoes because they were easy to grow. Samuel had promised to water them, but during the worst years of his addiction, he forgot. The plants died, and his daughter stopped asking him to plant anything with her. Samuel did not tell these stories to teach Darren a lesson. He never said that everything happened for a reason or that pain would make them stronger. He simply described the things he had lost. His honesty made the silence inside Darren's room feel less lonely. Over the next several days, Samuel continued to sit in the hallway. Sometimes he told stories. Sometimes he said nothing at all. Darren slowly began leaving the door open a few inches. He still did not come outside, but he listened. One afternoon, Samuel spoke about the telephone calls he had ignored while using drugs. His daughter had called to ask for help, to tell him she was getting married, and sometimes only to hear his voice. Samuel had seen her name on the screen, but often let the phone ring because he was ashamed of the condition he was in. He always believed he would call when he was sober, clean, and ready to be the father she deserved. When that day finally came, his daughter no longer wanted to answer. Darren understood the story immediately. He thought of his mother waiting beside the hotel door and all the silent calls he had made over the years. He had also believed that love should only see him after he was repaired. In trying to protect his mother from the man he had become, he had left her alone with no son at all. Darren opened the door enough to see Samuel sitting against the opposite wall. The older man's hair was gray, and his hands shook slightly as he rested them on his knees. He did not look like someone who had defeated his past. He looked like someone who was learning how to carry it. Darren admitted that he did not know how to face his mother. Evelyn had spent years waiting while he disappeared, broke promises, and refused help. He feared that accepting her love would be selfish because he could never return the years she had lost. Samuel looked at the floor before answering. We may not have the right to demand forgiveness, but we still have a responsibility to become the kind of people they will not regret finding if they ever decide to open the door again. The words stayed with Darren long after Samuel walked away. He could not force his mother to forget the pain. He could not return missed birthdays or sleepless nights. But perhaps recovery was not about earning the right to be loved again. Perhaps it was about becoming present enough to receive whatever love remained. That evening, Darren left his room and entered the dining hall. He chose a seat near the exit and kept his eyes lowered, but he stayed through the entire meal. He did not hide any bread in his pockets. The following morning, he attended group therapy. He sat near the door and said nothing, but he did not leave. Later, he opened the notebook the center had given him. For several minutes, he stared at the empty first page. Then he wrote, "I am afraid that everyone will leave when they see how difficult I am." Darren read the sentence twice. He had not solved anything. He was still frightened, ashamed, and uncertain about the days ahead, but for the first time, he had placed the fear into words instead of allowing it to control him in silence. Outside his room, Samuel sat in the hallway again. This time, Darren opened the door before the older man began telling a story. The doctors did not ask Darren to repair his entire life at once. They knew that large promises often became another reason for him to feel like a failure. Instead, they gave him 3 simple goals: eat 3 meals each day, sleep in the bed instead of on the floor, and call someone when the panic became too strong to handle alone. To most people, those things sounded ordinary. To Darren, they felt almost impossible. Breakfast was often the hardest. Darren sat near the dining room exit, watching every person who entered and listening for doors closing in the hallway. He still ate too quickly, and his hand sometimes moved toward his pocket when bread was placed on the table. Each time, he reminded himself that lunch would come later. The food would not disappear because he had trusted it to remain. Some mornings, finishing a bowl of oatmeal required more strength than playing an entire basketball game once had. Sleeping in the bed was another quiet battle. For several nights, Darren lay on top of the blankets with his shoes beside him, prepared to leave at the first sign of danger. He woke often to check the door and look beneath the bed. Slowly, he began removing his shoes. Then one night, He pulled the blanket over himself and slept for nearly 4 hours without waking. No one celebrated the next morning because no one else knew. But Darren wrote the number 4 in his notebook and circled it twice. The hardest goal was calling for help. Darren had spent years disappearing whenever his mind became unstable. He believed people would become tired of him if they saw how often he struggled. One evening, the panic returned while he was alone in his room. His chest tightened, the walls seemed to move closer, and every part of him wanted to run. Darren reached for the phone Marcus had given him. His finger rested over the number for several minutes before he finally called the center's night counselor. The counselor stayed on the line until Darren's breathing slowed. Nothing dramatic happened. There was no ambulance, no locked room, and no one punished him for being afraid. The next morning, Darren wrote another sentence in his notebook. I asked for help before I disappeared. For the first time, he understood that needing someone did not always mean losing control. Sometimes it meant choosing to remain alive long enough for the fear to pass. Every evening, Evelyn called. She never asked when Darren would be cured or when he planned to return home. She asked what he had eaten that day. Darren would list the meals carefully: eggs and toast for breakfast, soup for lunch, chicken and rice for dinner. These small reports became the most important part of Evelyn's day. For years, she had gone to bed without knowing whether her son was hungry, cold, or even alive. After each call, Evelyn sat alone at her kitchen table and cried. They were not the desperate tears she had cried while watching his video or waiting for an unknown number to call. These were quieter tears. Her son had eaten 3 meals. He had slept beneath a roof. He had spoken to her before night came. For a mother who had spent years fearing the worst, those ordinary facts felt like gifts. There was one place at the center Darren still avoided. Behind the main building stood a small basketball court with a cracked surface and a faded hoop. Residents sometimes played there in the afternoon, but Darren always took another path. Even the sound of a ball striking the ground made his body tense. It brought back the arenas, the injuries, the reporters, and the years when everyone praised his strength while his mind was quietly falling apart. Basketball had once been the safest part of Darren's life. As a child, he played because it was the one thing that made the world feel simple. If he aimed correctly and released the ball at the right moment, it went through the hoop. But as he grew older, the game became tied to everything he feared losing. Every missed shot affected contracts, headlines, and the way strangers spoke about him. Eventually, Darren could no longer separate the game he loved from the pressure that had nearly destroyed him. One afternoon, Samuel found him sitting near the garden. The older man carried a basketball beneath one arm and walked toward the empty court without explaining himself. Darren followed reluctantly, stopping several feet from the sideline. Samuel bounced the ball once, then passed it toward him. Darren caught it without thinking. His hands remembered before his mind could object. The ball felt familiar, but not comforting. Darren stared at the worn surface and remembered the last game of his career. He remembered the pain in his knee, the crowd shouting after a missed shot, and the silence in the locker room when he realized the team no longer trusted him. He tried to hand the ball back, but Samuel stepped away. Darren finally moved toward the free throw line and took a shot. The ball struck the rim and bounced away. Darren tried again and missed. The third shot hit the side of the backboard. Anger rose quickly inside him. His shoulders tightened and he threw the ball across the court. For a moment, he was no longer standing at a recovery center. He was back beneath the arena lights, hearing thousands of people decide whether he was still valuable. Samuel slowly retrieved the ball and placed it back in Darren's hands. He did not correct his form or tell him to calm down. "You spent years shooting so people would cheer," Samuel said. "Try one now, just to remember that your hands still belong to you." Darren stood quietly at the line. He looked at the hoop, then down at the ball. There were no cameras, coaches, contracts, or fans waiting for him to succeed. Nothing would be taken away if he missed. No one's opinion of him would change. He bent his knees and released the ball. It struck the backboard, touched the rim, and fell through the net. The sound was small in the empty court. There were no stadium lights and no announcer calling his name. Samuel stood near the sideline and clapped slowly, just once for each step Darren had taken to reach that moment. Darren turned his face away, but the tears came before he could stop them. It was not the most difficult shot Darren had ever made. It was not the most important according to any scoreboard. No one would replay it on television or print it in the morning paper. Yet, it meant more to him than many of the shots that had once made entire arenas rise to their feet. For the first time, Darren had touched a basketball without asking it to prove that he deserved love, money, respect, or a place in the world. He had taken the shot simply because he wanted to feel the ball leave his hands and hear it pass through the net. Samuel tossed the ball back to him. Darren wiped his face and returned to the line. This time, he was not playing for applause. He was playing because a small part of him had begun to feel alive again. The doctors did not ask Darren to fix his entire life at once. They gave him 3 simple goals: eat 3 meals a day, sleep in the bed instead of on the floor, and call someone when the panic became too strong. To most people, these things sounded ordinary. To Darren, each one felt like a test. At breakfast, he always sat near the exit and watched every person entering the room. He still ate quickly, and his hand sometimes moved toward his pocket when bread was placed on the table. Each time, he reminded himself that lunch would come later and no one would take the food away. Some mornings, finishing a bowl of oatmeal required more courage than playing before thousands of fans. Sleeping in the bed was another quiet struggle. At first, Darren lay on top of the blankets with his shoes beside him, ready to leave at the first sign of danger. One night, he finally removed his shoes, pulled the blanket over himself, and slept for 4 hours without waking. No one else knew how important that was, but Darren wrote the number 4 in his notebook and circled it twice. The hardest goal was asking for help. One evening, panic tightened around his chest and every part of him wanted to run. Darren held the phone Marcus had given him for several minutes before calling the center's night counselor. The counselor stayed with him until his breathing became steady again. The next morning, Darren wrote, "I asked for help before I disappeared." Every evening, Evelyn called. She never asked when he would be cured or when he would return home. She only asked what he had eaten. Darren carefully listed each meal, sometimes adding small details about the food. For the first time in years, Evelyn knew her son was warm, fed, and alive before she went to sleep. After each call, she sat alone at her kitchen table and cried. These were no longer tears of fear. Her son had eaten 3 meals, slept beneath a roof, and spoken to her before nightfall. To other people, those things might have seemed small. To a mother who had spent years not knowing whether her child was alive, they felt like miracles. There was one place Darren still avoided. Behind the recovery center stood a small basketball court with cracked pavement and a faded hoop. The sound of a bouncing ball brought back roaring crowds, painful injuries, and the pressure to appear strong while his mind was falling apart. Basketball had once made life feel simple, but as Darren became famous, every shot began to carry the weight of contracts, headlines, and public approval. He stopped playing because he loved the game and began playing because he feared who he would be without it. One afternoon, Samuel found Darren near the garden and carried a basketball toward the empty court. He bounced it once, then passed it to Darren. Darren caught it without thinking. His hands remembered the movement, even though his mind wanted to let go. He stepped toward the free throw line and took a shot. The ball struck the rim and bounced away. He missed again, then threw the third shot against the side of the backboard. Anger rose inside him, and he pushed the ball away as memories of disappointed crowds returned. Samuel slowly retrieved it and placed it back into Darren's hands. "You spent years shooting so people would cheer," he said. "Take one shot just to remember that your hands still belong to you." Darren looked around the empty court. There were no coaches, reporters, contracts, or fans waiting to judge him. Nothing would be taken away if he missed. He bent his knees and released the ball. It touched the backboard, rolled along the rim, and dropped through the net. The sound was small, but Darren stood frozen beneath the basket. Samuel clapped slowly from the sideline. There were no arena lights and no crowd calling Darren's name, yet tears filled his eyes. It was not the greatest shot of his career. No one would replay it on television or remember it the next morning. But it was the first time Darren had touched a basketball without asking the game to prove that he deserved love, respect, or a place in the world. Samuel passed the ball back to him. Darren wiped his face and returned to the line. This time, he was not playing for applause. He was playing because, for the first time in years, the game made him feel alive. Leo Martinez arrived at the recovery center late one evening after surviving an overdose. He was 19, thin, angry, and determined to reject everyone who came near him. He refused food, pushed over a chair, and locked himself inside his room. When staff members tried to speak with him, he shouted that his family had not brought him there to help him. They had sent him away because they were tired of carrying him. Darren recognized the anger immediately. He had once used the same anger to keep people at a distance. It was easier to act as though he needed no one than to admit how badly he feared being left. Leo did not truly believe that help was useless. He believed help would disappear the moment he became difficult. The next morning, Darren placed a tray of food outside Leo's door. A few seconds later, the door opened and the tray was kicked across the hallway. Darren quietly cleaned the floor and returned the following day with another meal. This time, he left the tray near the wall and sat several feet away with a newspaper. He did not ask Leo to come out. He did not explain how lucky he was to be alive or tell him to be grateful. Darren knew that people in pain often heard advice as another form of judgment. So he stayed in the hallway, sometimes reading and sometimes sitting in silence. The same thing happened for several days. Darren brought food, and Leo refused it. Some days the tray remained untouched. On others, the door opened only long enough for Leo to push it away. Darren always returned. One afternoon, Leo finally spoke from behind the door. His voice was tired rather than angry. He asked why Darren had not given up like everyone else. Darren looked at the closed door and remembered Samuel sitting outside his room, Marcus wading through the rain, and his mother leaning against a hotel door without demanding that he open it. "Someone once waited longer than my despair," Darren said. "I am only returning that time to you." The hallway became quiet again. A few minutes later, the door opened only a few inches. Leo did not show his face. One hand reached through the gap and pulled the bowl of soup inside. Darren did not smile or make the moment larger than it was. He simply folded the newspaper and walked away, allowing Leo to keep his dignity. But the small movement changed something inside Darren. For months, he had seen himself only as the man others had rescued, the man Marcus found in the rain, the son his mother waited for, and the patient Samuel refused to abandon. Now he understood that his suffering had not left him empty. It had taught him how to recognize fear hidden beneath anger and how to remain beside someone without making that person feel weak. Darren began spending more time helping new residents. He cleaned the basketball court in the mornings, carried meals to people who were too frightened to enter the dining room, and repaired old garden benches with Samuel. He never called himself a counselor. He was simply a man who knew what it felt like to believe that every open door would eventually close. Several days later, Leo stepped into the hallway and sat beside Darren. Neither of them spoke for a while. Darren did not need to hear a thank you. The fact that Leo had opened the door was enough. For the first time, Darren understood that being saved was not the end of his story. Sometimes, the person who had once needed someone to stay could could become the reason another person chose not to disappear. After completing the main phase of treatment, Darren was offered a part-time job at the recovery center. He would welcome new residents, deliver meals, clean the common areas, and sit with people who were too frightened to join group therapy. The work was simple and the paycheck was small, but Darren accepted it with a seriousness he had once reserved for professional contracts. On his first morning, a staff member handed him a plastic name badge. It read, Darren Wade, Support Staff. There was no jersey number beneath his name. It did not mention the games he had won, the money he had earned, or the years he had spent homeless. For the first time in a long while, his name was not attached to a headline about something he had lost or done wrong. Darren studied the badge for several seconds before pinning it to his shirt. He had once worn his name across the back of a jersey while thousands of people watched him. Yet this small piece of plastic meant more to him than many of those uniforms. It did not ask him to entertain anyone. It simply said that he belonged somewhere and that someone trusted him to help. When Darren received his first paycheck, he did not buy new clothes or replace the old shoes he still kept in his room. He bought his mother a simple telephone. Evelyn's old phone had received years of silent calls, moments when Darren had dialed her number but could not speak. When he gave her the new one, he explained that he wanted the first call it received to contain his voice. That evening, he called her from his room at the center. Evelyn answered, and Darren told her about his first day at work. He described the name badge, the residents he had helped, and the meal he had eaten during his break. There was no silence between them this time. Several weeks later, Darren returned to Dallas to find Noah. He carried the old cardboard sign from the gas station folded inside his bag, though he was not sure why he had kept it. Perhaps he needed to see the place again and understand that the man who had stood there had not completely disappeared. The gas station looked almost unchanged. The same lights shone above the pumps, and rain stains still marked the brick wall beneath the awning. But Noah was not behind the counter, and no newspapers were stacked near the entrance. Mr. Harris told Darren that Noah's mother had become seriously ill and had been admitted to the hospital. Noah had stopped attending school regularly and taken several small jobs to help pay rent and buy groceries. While Marcus, Evelyn, and Samuel had been helping Darren survive, the boy who gave him a sandwich had been fighting his own quiet battle. Darren found Noah unloading boxes behind a neighborhood grocery store. The boy looked older than Darren remembered. His clothes were worn, his hands were red from the cold, and the tiredness in his face did not belong to a child. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Noah smiled. He had kept the wristband. Later that afternoon, Noah brought Darren to the small apartment he shared with his mother. From beneath his bed, he pulled out the metal box where he once kept his newspaper money. Inside were a few coins, hospital receipts, and Darren's faded wristband, carefully wrapped in clean cloth. Noah placed it in Darren's hand. The wristband had once represented Darren's final professional game. He had believed it was the last proof that he had once mattered. But as he held it again, Darren understood that its meaning had changed. He placed it back in Noah's hands. "This used to remind me of the last time a crowd called my name," Darren said. "Now it reminds me of the night one person saw me when everyone else was only watching." Noah tried to return it, but Darren closed the boy's fingers around the worn fabric. He wanted Noah to keep it as a reminder that kindness did not have to be large to change a life. Sometimes a sandwich offered without judgment could reach farther than money, fame, or applause ever had. When Marcus learned about Noah's mother, he arranged help with her medical expenses and made sure Noah could return to school without worrying that his family would lose their home. Noah initially refused. He explained that he had not fed Darren because he expected a reward. He had only seen a hungry man and done what felt right. Darren understood. "This is not payment," he told him. "You gave me enough kindness to survive one night. I'm only helping that kindness travel a little farther." Noah finally accepted. Before Darren left, The boy placed the wristband around his wrist. It was too large, so he tightened it until it stayed in place. Darren looked at him and remembered the child standing behind the gas station window, seeing a human being where everyone else saw a fallen celebrity. Years earlier, Darren had believed kindness was a debt he would never be able to repay. Now he understood that kindness was not meant to be paid back. It was meant to be passed on. For several months, Darren's life had begun to feel steady. He worked at the recovery center, helped new residents, called his mother every evening, and returned to Dallas whenever he could. Then a reporter discovered where he was working. Within days, his photograph appeared across news websites beside headlines about the fallen basketball star who had rebuilt his life. At first, the attention seemed positive. Reporters praised Marcus for saving Darren, and strangers sent messages saying his recovery had inspired them. Television programs presented Darren as proof that anyone could change if given a second chance. But the story quickly became larger than the real man living inside it. The public no longer saw a person recovering one day at a time. They saw a symbol who was expected to remain strong, grateful, and successful. Alongside the praise came cruel predictions. Some people said Darren would eventually relapse because men like him never truly changed. Others claimed Marcus had paid for the entire story to improve his own reputation. Every photograph of Darren was examined, and every tired expression became evidence that he was failing again. The same strangers who once laughed at him in the rain were now waiting for him to prove that their worst beliefs had been correct. Darren told everyone that the attention did not bother him, but he began sleeping less. He stopped calling the night counselor when panic came and started hiding food in his room again. At work, he smiled for residents and told them not to be ashamed of difficult days. When he was alone, however, he felt ashamed of his own. He was afraid that admitting he was struggling would disappoint Marcus, his mother, Leo, and everyone who now looked to him as proof that recovery was possible. Evelyn's birthday was approaching, and Darren promised to come home for dinner. She spent the morning preparing the stew he had loved as a child. For years, she had placed an empty plate on the table, even though she knew he would probably not arrive. This time, the plate was not a symbol of hope. She believed her son would actually sit in front of it. Darren left the center carrying a small gift for his mother. But at the bus station, he saw another article about himself on a stranger's phone. The headline asked how long the former athlete's miracle recovery would last. His chest tightened, and the noise around him became distant. Instead of calling someone, Darren walked away. One bad decision led to another. By nightfall, he was in a part of the city he had promised himself he would never return to. The next morning, Darren woke on the floor of an unfamiliar room. His head hurt, his clothes were dirty, and the support staff badge had broken inside his pocket. The small plastic badge that once made him feel trusted now seemed like proof that he had fooled everyone. His phone contained dozens of missed calls. Marcus had called. The center had called. Leo had called again and again. Most painful of all were the calls from his mother, beginning in the afternoon and continuing long after the dinner she prepared had grown cold. Darren could not bring himself to answer. He imagined Evelyn sitting beside the plate that was no longer supposed to be empty. He believed he had destroyed everything people had given him. Marcus had found him in the rain, Samuel had sat outside his door, and the center had trusted him to help others. Now, Darren was certain that returning would only show them their kindness had been wasted. He listened to the voicemail messages one by one. Some were worried and urgent, but none were angry. Leo's voice appeared near the end. The young man said he did not know where Darren was, so he was sitting outside Darren's empty room at the center. Darren had once waited outside Leo's locked door without knowing whether it would ever open. Leo wanted him to know that someone was now doing the same for him. The final message was from Evelyn. She did not ask why Darren had missed her birthday. She did not mention the hours she had spent waiting or the meal that had gone cold. She simply told him the food was still in the refrigerator and no one had taken his chair. Darren listened to the message several times. Then he called her. When Evelyn answered, he could barely speak. He admitted that he had fallen again and that he did not know how to return after disappointing everyone. There was a long silence, but it did not feel like punishment. It sounded like a mother taking a breath before lifting something heavy. "You do not have to stand before I come," she said. "Let me find you exactly where you have fallen." Darren gave her the address. Marcus and Evelyn arrived together. When they entered the room, Darren was sitting on the floor with his back against the wall. He could not look at them. The broken name badge rested in his hand, and the gift he had bought for his mother was still inside its bag. Evelyn did not ask him to explain. She sat on the floor beside him, even though her knees made the movement painful. She took the unopened birthday gift from the bag and placed it next to her. The present no longer mattered. Her son was alive and sitting close enough for her to touch. Darren told Marcus that he had ruined the ending everyone expected. The newspapers wanted a miracle, the center needed a success story, and his mother deserved a son who could keep his promises. Darren believed one relapse had exposed the truth, that he had never truly changed. Marcus looked at the broken badge in Darren's hand. He remembered the man kneeling in the muddy parking lot and the open car door on that cold morning. Darren had fallen again, but he had also called before disappearing completely. That mattered. "I never helped you because I needed a beautiful story," Marcus said. "I helped you because even if you fall again tomorrow, you are still a human being worth bringing home today." Darren finally looked at him. There was no anger in Marcus's face and no disappointment in Evelyn's. There was fear, exhaustion, and pain, but they were still there. Darren had believed love was a reward that could be taken away after one mistake. Instead, two people had crossed the city to sit beside him on the floor. He agreed to return to treatment. The drive back was quiet. Darren sat beside his mother in the rear seat, his head resting near her shoulder. Evelyn held his hand as she had when he was a child, before fame, illness, and years of distance had separated them. She did not ask him to promise that this would never happen again. When they reached the recovery center, Leo was still sitting outside Darren's room. Darren stopped in the hallway, unable to speak. Leo stood and stepped aside, leaving the door open. The bed had been made, a plastic cup stood on the table, and Darren's place had not been given away. The relapse had taken one night from him. It had not taken his name, his room, or the people who loved him. For the first time, Darren understood that returning after a fall was also part of recovery. Darren's recovery did not become perfect after he returned to the center. There were still mornings when he woke with fear pressing against his chest, and nights when sleep would not come. Some days, a closing door or a cruel comment online brought back memories he thought he had left behind. There were moments when he wanted to turn off his phone, pack his things, and disappear before anyone could see that he was struggling again. But Darren had changed in one important way. He no longer disappeared without telling anyone. When the fear became too strong, he called a counselor. When he felt ashamed, he spoke to Samuel instead of locking himself away. If he made a mistake, he returned and admitted it rather than deciding that one bad day had destroyed every good day before it. Darren slowly understood that recovery was not about becoming someone who never fell. It was about learning that falling did not have to become the end of the road. A relapse could take away a night or a week, but it could not erase every meal he had finished, every frightened person he had comforted, or every time he had chosen to stay. The people around him were also moving forward in their own imperfect ways. Samuel continued writing letters to his daughter without asking her to forgive him. For months, there was no reply. Then one afternoon, a small envelope arrived at the center. Inside was a family photograph and a short note. His daughter was not ready to see him, but she had read every letter and was willing to receive more. Samuel held the photograph against his chest. It was not the reunion he had dreamed about, but it was no longer silence. For a man who had spent years facing a closed door, even a small opening was enough to keep him going. Leo completed treatment and began training as a community support counselor. Before leaving the center, he stood outside the same room where he had once locked himself away. He told Darren that he might never have opened the door if Darren had tried to lecture him or force him to change. Darren had simply stayed long enough for Leo to believe someone might still be there when he was ready. Back in Dallas, Noah returned to school after his mother's health improved. He kept Darren's faded wristband inside the same metal box that had once held his newspaper money. To other people, it looked like an old piece of fabric. To Noah, it was proof that one small act of kindness could travel farther than anyone expected. Several years later, Marcus funded a small residential home near the recovery center. It was meant for people who had finished treatment but had no safe place to go. Darren helped plan every room. He insisted that each door have a lock on the inside. Every bed had to be clean and ready before a resident arrived. Each room needed a small cabinet filled with food that could be opened at any hour without asking permission. Darren remembered sleeping on a hotel floor because the bed seemed too clean for him. He remembered hiding bread in his coat because he could not believe another meal would come. No one entering the new home would have to feel that way. Marcus suggested placing Darren's name above the entrance. Darren refused. Marcus did not put his own name there either. Instead, they hung a simple wooden sign beside the front door. You do not have to prove that you deserve help before entering. The home opened without a large ceremony. There were no television cameras and no reporters waiting outside. Darren welcomed the first residents himself. Some arrived angry. Others were afraid to make eye contact. A few carried everything they owned in plastic bags. Darren understood each of them. One stormy night, he noticed an elderly man standing outside the gate. The man was soaked and shivering, but he would not come inside. He had no money, no identification, and no family member willing to take responsibility for him. He believed the staff would turn him away as soon as they learned he had nothing to offer. Darren walked into the rain and brought him inside. He found dry clothes and placed a bowl of hot soup on the table. The old man sat carefully on the edge of the chair. When he noticed mud spreading beneath his shoes, he began apologizing. He tried to stand, afraid that he had already ruined his chance to stay. Darren froze for a moment. He remembered standing beside Marcus's car years earlier, removing his broken shoes because he was afraid of staining the clean leather. He remembered Marcus bending down, picking up those muddy shoes, and placing them inside. Darren took a towel and laid it beneath the old man's feet. The floor can be cleaned, he said. Tonight, all you have to do is stay. The elderly man lowered his head and began to cry. Darren did not ask him to stop. He sat across from him until the soup was finished. There were no promises about tomorrow and no questions about the man's past. For one night, he had a warm room, food, and a door he could lock from the inside. It was enough. Later that week, Darren returned to his mother's house. Evelyn was older now. Her hair had turned almost completely gray, and she walked slowly, holding the furniture for balance. Darren had offered to buy her a larger home, but she refused. She wanted to remain in the house where she had raised him and where she had kept his room waiting. When Darren entered the kitchen, there were 2 plates on the table. There was no longer an empty place set as a symbol of hope. He sat in the chair that had remained vacant for so many birthdays. The stew had cooled because he arrived a little late, but Evelyn did not complain. She watched him eat, occasionally moving the best pieces of meat into his bowl, as she had when he was a child. Darren noticed her looking at him and smiled. He was no longer the basketball star whose name once filled arenas. He had not become a man who would never struggle again. There were still difficult days ahead, and both of them knew it. But he was there. He had kept his promise to sit at the table. Rain began tapping against the kitchen window. Darren stopped eating, and listened. Years earlier, that sound had meant cold sidewalks, muddy shoes, and another night spent trying to survive. For a moment, Evelyn watched his face, afraid the memories might pull him away again. Darren looked toward the rain, then he turned back to his mother and continued eating. For the first time, he did not feel the need to run. When dinner was over, Darren helped Evelyn clear the table. Before going to bed, she left the front door slightly open so the cool evening air could enter the house. Warm light spilled across the porch and into the darkness beyond it. The door was not open because the world had run out of people who were lost. It remained open because somewhere, someone might still be looking for the courage to come home. And this time, there would be someone waiting on the other side.